All right, great day, Gadfly subscribers, and thank you for tuning in to our Gadfly live stream with London Paul of the Sirius Report. Today is Tuesday, April the 7th. The reason why I always repeat the date and say the date is just so that I know what day of the week it is and the month. So, so I want to again thank our subscribers, and Paul is joined today by a very special guest, Sunny, a return, someone that's returning to the Gadfly to join us for a conversation today. So, Paul and Sunny, good day.
Good morning, CJ.
Yes, obviously these are very interesting times that everyone is navigating through, and I think it's always a value to seek out different opinions on how people are handling things. Obviously, I'm more Midwest, Central Indiana, and Sunny's tuning in to us more from the East Coast. So we're going to get some different perspectives on things. But Paul, I'll turn it over to you, and we'll begin the conversation.
Yeah, well, firstly, obviously, I'm not going to say too much. We're here to get Sunny's observations. And, you and I, CJ, have talked about our own perspective on the lockdown. So I'd be interested to get Sunny's perspective on things and from his own personal thing, and in a broader context, his views on things. I think it'd be extremely interesting and enlightening to get his observations.
Well, thank you very much for having me on again. I appreciate that very much. Glad that people enjoyed the last time we got together, and hopefully they'll enjoy this as well. So I really enjoyed yesterday's podcast between the two of you, focusing on a few things, and then Lisa wrote the article for the SiriusReport.com about the third way, and that was very interesting. And not to rehash, but there were those two sources have really been stirring around in my mind, and kind of wanted to revisit some of those topics and then step back a little bit. I'll start by kind of what local conditions are here. I'm in the Southeast on the coast in North Carolina, and every community is different, and every area is having a different experience of this lockdown and virus. There is a very large military installation in my town, and so for Eastern North Carolina, we're a bit more international, a bit more influenced by the outside world than the towns just on the north and south or west of here. So we do have cases, we do have deaths. It is an issue here, but at the same time, we're not a big city or anything like that. So we're not in any kind of epicenter, or it's not quite as taken quite as seriously by the population here as it is elsewhere. There are a lot of people still out and about. The stores are still busy and thriving. I mean, a lot of places are shut down, a lot of the restaurants and things like that. But if you go to the grocery stores or Walmart or what have you, you'll find plenty of people out and about. So it's not had a huge impact on daily life in that respect. There's still food on the shelves, things like that. And actually, I've noticed in the community there are still a lot of people focused on the flu, and to say, okay, well, why are we locked down, and everything along those lines, which you guys have discussed. This is not the flu. This is not in relation to that. It can't be compared with that. The number of deaths here, to say, okay, well, we've only had X number of deaths, and other situations are many times that, and we don't take similar measures. That's just not a rational perspective. We're dealing with an unknown here, and many other things that you guys have discussed. But there is still a lot of that perspective in in our area, and I understand that. But the one thing that I wanted to bring out from what you guys discussed yesterday, it is a bit of empathy for all those perspectives that, aren't necessarily correct and they're not necessarily helpful or useful. But this period of history is the word that keeps coming to my mind is disorienting. When it comes down to the pandemic, or if you look at the financial markets, or kind of in every direction you look, things are so upended that everyone, I think, on a collective level is feeling a lot of disorientation. And I think it goes back long before the pandemic. Paul, I remember you talking about an elderly neighbor of yours that passed away several months ago, and you had mentioned that you felt like there were a lot of people, quote unquote, checking out because they had some subconscious or unconscious recognition of what was coming down the line, the chaos of the reset. And do you remember that?
Yeah, yes, exactly. And it's hard to quantify, but I agree with what you said. And yes, I did. I had an elderly neighbour, and I mean, this was obviously in my. She lived literally across the road from my parents, and that's a whole separate story. But I've known her for all my life. From since I can remember. Yeah, she started to. Kind of, you could sense she'd kind of lost the impetus to want to live anymore, effectively. And at that age, people generally just go to bed and don't wake up. And that was kind of exactly what happened with her. And I've seen, other instances. The demographic in my parents' area is people go there and never move. So you've got all these people like in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and even 100. And they just never move. So there's this kind of aging demographic in that area. So you see more. Yeah, of course, there are health issues with people, but some people, maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's not. But I agree with you. That was very prevalent. I noticed. And she was obviously an example of
that. And I think it's not just limited to elderly folks, which I've always appreciated your appreciation for the elderly, your respect for folks that are older. That's noteworthy. But I think everybody has picked up on it at that unconscious level that things are changing in a radical way. And, the whole reset process, people are largely ignorant, but at that unconscious, subconscious level, I think that there is a understanding that things are changing, and perhaps more than they've ever changed in all of human history. And so that preceded the quarantine, but it has underlined the whole experience. And then when you add this quarantine where everybody's in lockdown worldwide, you've got incredible amounts of job loss. You've got so much uncertainty on a personal level. You've got this just extremely disorienting experience. And in the midst of that, people are attempting to get their bearings in any way that they can. So, a tendency in humanity is to view situations and experiences through your own lens and your own biases and perspectives. And, you have people doing that, and I'm doing that, and you're doing that. And unfortunately, a lot of those biases and perspectives are slightly off the mark. And you mentioned yesterday the increase in gun ownership. Well, there's a tremendous level of distrust of the government in the United States, and that is basically very justified. We've all witnessed the insanity of the last 30 years, and everybody more or less knows that it's what the government says and what the government does are not sound policies or ways of conducting business. And so we all, have this notion that we shouldn't believe what the government tells us, and we shouldn't follow along blindly and everything on that level. And, the United States government is quick to use violence as a means of accomplishing their goals. And so I think on a lot of levels, many people have a basic expectation that, there will at some point be a violent and forceful government to deal with. The U.S. government has unleashed that violence on the rest of the world for many times, many examples, and they're quick to do so. And so on that level, it's not it's pretty rational to have that concern and to take measures. Most folks are well armed, so I'm a little bit surprised that it's increased so much in only the last few weeks, because at least in my area, we have a lot of veterans, and it's the South. There's a lot of hunters, things like that. So I'd be surprised if 75-80% of the population here are gun owners. I'd be surprised if it were any less than that. But and then so that kind of gets into this whole notion. Okay, well, the end goal here is increased police state type scenario, loss of liberty, that perhaps this pandemic was a pandemic, and the end goal here is ever more government control and things along those lines. And I'm sure that in the halls of power there are nefarious individuals that are opportunistic and seeking to take advantage of the situation. I don't deny that, but in this particular scenario, and then overall, I think the most important thing is to try and step back from the situation and look at it from the big picture. And at a big picture level, whether it's on the financial end of things or on the medical end of things or overall, this is not a planned scenario. This is not a coordinated, well thought out means of achieving ends. This is blind panic on many levels. This is ineptitude, Keystone Cops on other levels. And that's pretty easy to kind of see and come to grips with. So if you keep that, if you factor that into your thinking in all the situations, it kind of diffuses a lot of the problematic scenarios. So if you say to yourself, okay, government is not in control here. Government is in responsive mode, not any type of plan or any type of design here. We don't have a pre-written Patriot Act that has been inserted into Congress, minutes after 9/11. This doesn't resemble that. That kind of helps to keep some of the more fearful scenarios from kind of taking over your perspective, and you have to do that across the board. So one particular instance where I think this is also helpful, you mentioned yesterday the hospitals. So folks are taking videos of their local hospitals and saying, okay, well, this doesn't fit. There's no chaos. There's no overwhelming of hospitals. And that much is definitely true. But you made the point that's largely because normal activities of hospitals have been suspended for the most part. And, I wanted to add to that, a business partner of mine is dating a surgeon that works for one of the largest medical groups in the country. There are something like 700 providers in that network, and they're losing $35 million a day because all non-emergency surgeries have been suspended indefinitely. And many doctors and surgeons have seen their incomes just disappear. So that kind of accounts for that. And that's not a plan. You don't have the hospitals kind of orchestrating some type of trickery scenario. This is all chaos for them in their operations, and they're losing a tremendous amount of money. I saw one of those videos where someone was up in arms because, in addition to there being no people standing in line out the door trying to get tested and treated, there was a little sign that had some language that said that a drill was in progress. And that was taken as evidence that, this is all a hoax. And that's just not the case. That's, some sign they had printed up already, and they were putting out these barricades as a precautionary measure to control the flow of foot traffic and automobile traffic. And that sign was just placed there. It doesn't really have any meaning. So kind of stepping back from the tiny bits of evidence that are cobbled together to kind of confirm a perspective that the government is, out to get us and out to increase their control and authority, and looking and saying, wait a minute, that's equally evidence that there's a lack of control. There's actually chaos at all the various levels. So, in response to this disorientation and this kind of overwhelming experience that we're all faced with, there's this natural tendency to view everything through these pre-existing lenses, which are not totally invalid. There is some validity there. Yes, we should be concerned because we have seen our liberties eroded, and we have seen the government take control and authority that they shouldn't have. That's been a trend, a long-standing trend, and there probably are some concerning things going on behind the scenes at this moment. But and that's just one of the perspectives that's becoming problematic. There's the 5G and the vaccines and many others as well. But rather than trying to filter everything that we see through those lenses, in the face of this disorientation, I think it's most helpful to step back and kind of rebuild your big picture understanding of what's happening. And like the article you put out a couple of days ago, the list of 100 reasons why the deep state or the cabal or the New World Order, or whatever you want to call it, is failing and totally out of control, kind of check check your understanding, rebuild your perspective around the fact that in the current scenario, everything is out of control. This is not a plan. This is not a well orchestrated attempt to power grab and consolidate power and, take and have the Fed buy everything. So the Fed's power is increased to infinity, and now they own everything, and we'll never ever have a positive future. So stepping back and looking at the bigger picture and remembering the conditions, I think, is important. That's what I've been trying to do over the past weeks and months, because I faced this extremely disorienting situation as well, and I'll be the first to say, yeah, this is disorienting. This is a scenario where all of my assumptions, I've had to re-examine them. I've had to rebuild my own perspective. But that's kind of the main thought that I had yesterday during the podcast that you guys did is I empathize with everyone in terms of this disorientation, and I fully understand why people take the experience and fit it through their existing perspectives. But it's critical to step back and not do that, to step back and look for the basic things that are happening.
Yeah,
I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to take a breath now.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, you make some extremely valid points that I don't want to repeat them, but the only thing I would say is that to add to that, other than what we've already discussed or whatever else were, like CGen, etc., is I know for a fact that there is elements within the Trump administration who are desperate to get the economy back on track. Not yesterday, 2 weeks. They never wanted to shut anything down because they know full well the economic impact of doing this, and we don't need to discuss that because it's very self-evident. But as you say, this is not the mindset of people planning something. And you also made an excellent observation. We know post 9/11, within, I don't know, was it days? They produced this Patriot Act, which is hundreds and hundreds of pages long, which had obviously been written months and years before for exactly that scenario. And they rolled it out, and well, they haven't done that this time. There's nothing. Yeah, there's this lockdown, but it's just notional kind of. I mean, we had a small act here that was passed, which is very a lack of verbiage whatsoever. It's literally a page, and it makes some things with regards to how people should do things, but there's no great big long documentation of restricting people's liberties, and that doesn't exist in the US either. And I think that's an extremely important point that you've raised with regard to that. One thing I'd like to ask on, I mean, we always look in these situations where hopefully it galvanizes people. And I know from where I live, and it's only where I live, so it's not necessarily representative in a broader context. But even though people are isolated, you feel a really strong sense of community. I mean, I've had, I've put notes through a neighbour's dog because they're elderly, saying, "Look, if you need anything, here's my phone number." And they got a text message going, "I'm fine, but thank you." And I've had other neighbours doing the same thing, and everybody's interacting in a non sort of interacting way as human beings normally do. But I'm wondering, do you sense that from your perspective, that despite the fear of government, the people will have a collective or are having a more collective approach and an idea of work community and togetherness is important?
I want to say yes. I really want to echo that, and in some respects, yes, there is the notion that we're all in this situation together and having a common experience. And on an individual level, I look forward to kind of looking back with my kids and remembering this experience as, something absolutely historic, and we were there, and it's amazing. But equally to that, there is the notion that people are kind of fighting this here on a lot of different levels, and it could be just precisely who my friends and family list are on Facebook and other places, but there seem to be these little groups that are congregating and crystallizing around these ideas, and there seems to be kind of this rebelliousness that's going through to say, no, we need to ignore or fight this, or kind of resist this government push, and we need to get the economy back open post haste, and kind of all those different ideas seem to be equal in measure to the grace and the courtesy and the community and all of those things. So for me, it's been a bit of a mixed bag, kind of both. And we've got people being courteous and being understanding, and then lots and lots of reports and experiences of people being harsh with each other and being resistant and combative and that kind of thing. So I think it's a little bit all over the map for me.
Okay, I mean that's completely understandable. I mean, as I say, probably where I live is not representative of a demographic necessarily you get anywhere else. I mean, it tends, as I say, tend to be a lot of older people, and therefore, they probably have a very different perspective. Although, of course, there's a lot more fear in them because of their age and underlying health issues. But
well, the one thing you pointed out that applies to that demographic, which does not apply to any demographic that I'm a part of, elderly folks in the UK have experienced hardships that very few here have experienced. Even if you go back and, like, my mother lived through a portion at least of World War II, and then there was Vietnam and everything that she lived through. Sort of tangentially, my dad wasn't a veteran, and so she didn't have a loved one away at war and things like that. But even in that respect, it wasn't a war in the United States. There were always wars somewhere else, and they're not to make light of the hardships that Americans have faced through the years, but they're generally haven't been the extent that folks in the UK or in Europe or elsewhere in the world have faced in terms of war or economic hardship or things along those lines. Even terrorism. Yes, we had 9/11 here and things along those lines, but you pointed out what the UK faced with bombings and things like that domestically, and we just really haven't had that type of thing here. And so I worry, like you do, about the hardships that are coming around the corner, and how we're going to face those collectively.
yes, yeah, exactly. I think might be worth just sort of getting your perspective, given your professional background, your observations of markets, how that impacts your job, what, on a day-to-day basis, what you feel about gold and silver markets, and then maybe we'll just branch that out into other perspectives. But I'd be interested to get your feel, because, in in the role that you do in financial planning, etc., you're dealing with people on a day-to-day basis who are having to make decisions about what they want to do and what's the market's doing to potentially skew their perspective and understanding. Because if people see, like yesterday, I don't remember the date, I can't remember because I'm not paying too close attention to the sort of micro detail, but obviously the Dow was up about 7% or something. Now that can skew people's perspective, for example. So, and on all this wild gyrations in the paper, gold and silver market. So just if you can sort of encapsulate your observations about this and how it, that factors into what you're doing on a day-to-day basis in a professional capacity.
Okay, sure. No, that's another can of worms in so many regards, and I'll come back to this word disorientation because that has been something I've felt. Frankly, the volatility and 7% moves. I mean that is an extreme move, and we've had that on a near daily basis in both directions, and that'll make you kind of seasick and everything along those lines. But, to step back, my conversations with clients and folks going back to September were about inflation. And especially on Twitter, there's a lot of folks that are big believers in deflation and deleveraging and how that is going to be a deflationary process, and that's what we're experiencing now and things like that. And you and I had joked before, and I made a tweet at one point about deflation being to central bankers what terrorists are to governments and intelligence agencies. It's kind of like a boogeyman, and in some respects not possible until and unless central bankers somehow lose the will or the wherewithal to print or to inflate. So, I had been discussing inflation, and that's what we would see on, going forward with clients since that September timeframe when they started very inflationary policies of repo madness and not QE. And my expectation was they would continue that and expand it in that exponential way without necessarily needing a kick in the pants from an outside force like a pandemic. And I'll point to Rob Kirby, who I'm a big fan of. Rob Kirby, I listened to a podcast with him recently, and he pointed out that the pandemic, this coronavirus, gave the central bankers a beautiful justification, a perfect justification for their necessary policies of expanding the amount of money and amount of debt. That's kind of baked in the cake of the system we have, the way that fiat money is designed, and they had to do that. His conclusion was, because it gave that perfect excuse, it must be, somehow planned and unleashed or intentional. And I don't share that viewpoint, but it was still a brilliant observation, is that, yes, it did give the central bankers every justification to increase the scale in which they were engaged in the things that they had to do and were already doing on a smaller scale. But, for some reason, they paused that process around January the 1st, and they weren't expanding their balance sheet between around January the 1st through until later February and into March, where this outside force gave them that kick in the pants and started destabilizing everything. And so I've thought about that a lot. And, generally speaking, I think that's just down to ineptitude. These people are not all powerful. They're not. They're operating in not a pre-planned, well orchestrated way. They're in panic mode and kind of flying by the seat of their pants, and they have been. And that's why I think they just zigged when they should have zagged, or something along those lines. And they did get that kick in the pants that they apparently needed to crank everything into overdrive. But we got that really sharp and disorienting, overwhelming decline in markets, and now the inflation of we will buy everything and we will do it in an unlimited fashion is starting to kick in, kind of across the board. And so we're seeing these huge moves in equities, seeing continued increase in the gold price and silver price. But it's equally important to go back and look at that ineptitude and that flying by the seat of their pants mode. They're certainly going to zig when they should have zagged, and vice versa going forward as well. So we're likely to see just continued wild gyrations, stumbles and bumbles, but they've clearly communicated, hey, we're going to buy everything and we're going to do it in an unlimited way. So inflation is likely to rule the day. But what worries me is that within the financial realm, people have gone back to some of their biases and their perspectives, pre-held kind of filters that they run by, and had them reinforced. So I've talked with a lot of investors and friends and family and clients going back to late February when these waterfall declines started. And I can remember after, I think only the first or it was a week in February where we had basically 4,000 point declines in a row. I think it was after the second or third, someone said to me, and this was just the first time it happened dozens of times over the next weeks. Stocks are on sale. I should buy stocks now, shouldn't I? And for a while that turned out not to be the case whatsoever. There was far more to go down before there was any potential for a bottom formation and a sustained move back up. And then, people kept saying that. And then, at a certain point, those people were proved right in their mind and in their brokerage accounts, at least temporarily. And, until and unless there's a stumble from the central bankers, things like that, we could continue to see that from here on into the foreseeable future. But, I certainly think there will be stumbles, but regardless, they had that perspective of buy the dips, if you want to call it that, or stocks for the long run, or, stocks are on sale. They had that perspective reinforced, and that's of concern to me. In fact, I saw an interesting statistic from a group. I'll pull this up. It was called Statista, and it was a tweet, a little graphic and a tweet. Most Americans leave investments alone. You had categories of added more investments, moved money out of investments, intentionally did nothing, and folks that were unaware of volatility. The folks that were asleep and unaware accounted for about 10%. Then you had 13% of folks that added more investments, most of those being millennials, but then only about 10%, 11% moved money out of investments, and 2/3 did nothing. So, you had that experience in 2008 where markets declined and people who did nothing saw their accounts recover by around 2011. Sometime in 2011, most folks were getting back to that break-even point. And so you had that pattern kind of established, and then looking back at the dot-com bubble bursting, things like that. But that pattern and that perspective has had some degree of reinforcement through this experience. And, so many times on Facebook or just in conversations, people have said, oh, it always comes back. It always comes back. It always comes back. And, whether you look at the stock market or real estate or, any of the investable asset classes out there, there really is that perspective. Oh, it always comes back. And, people discount other data sets like the Great Depression, where it really didn't come back. It certainly didn't come back in a timely fashion. I had not an argument, but on Facebook, someone posted, any 10-year period, stocks are always positive. And yeah, that's not true. If you go back a little bit farther, it took quite a lot longer than 10 years for the market declines in the Great Depression to, get back to even or get positive. And I mentioned this last time. There's this long-term pendulum swing of investor preference for financial assets versus real assets. And when we spoke last time, I noted that February, I think it was February 19th was the high in the Dow. That February 19th may in the future represent that extreme of the pendulum swing in preference for financial assets. Where we sit now, it may not represent the far end of the extreme. They may pump it up to 39,000 or 49,000 or whatever it gets to. But it's unquestionable that the pendulum will swing in the other direction, where there will be this long-term secular preference for real assets as opposed to financial assets. There is going to be a period where the public won't want to have anything to do with financial assets for a long period of time. And so this reinforcement of belief that financial assets are wonderful and always will be, and generally in very short order by the dip, that's of concern to me. I'm concerned by the reinforcement of that paradigm.
Yeah, no, yes, I would agree with you. But I think the interesting thing is, from the people you deal with, how many of them really understand what's being done through QE, zero interest rate policy, why we have these enormous asset bubbles and all the things we've discussed and countless other people have discussed? Do they have any real understanding of this? And and trying to explain to them, which undoubtedly you have done, is have you got any traction in doing that with them?
Well, we have had countless discussions and explanations, but I don't believe there has been, and not to reach a point of hopelessness, but I'm not sure there'll ever be. Your perspective, I think, represents the opposite end of the spectrum. You've said on Twitter and in podcasts and on the Gadfly that the stock market is an illusion. And it is. I do understand that perspective, and fundamentally agree with it in that way. But I don't know that folks will ever reach that level of understanding. We can talk about things like corporate fundamentals are not what they should be to justify the price levels. We can talk about share buybacks being a huge part of the increase in price levels. We can talk about, QE policies, round robin QE from the central banks being responsible for the greatest bull market in history, or whatever, the longest 10 plus years of increasing prices. We can talk about those things, and they can understand and nod, and but it's hard for them to really internalize that, especially when they have the huge data input of money. They've got accounts that go up in value, and that means a lot. That impacts their thinking significantly, and it reinforces this notion that the stock market has become an incredible political tool, not just political, but socioeconomic tool. It influences attitudes and beliefs and behaviors. This notion of a wealth effect that Bernanke and the gang wanted to create, on the one hand, it's easy to say, okay, well, the 1% got a wealth effect, but the 99% just got maybe a whiff of the wealth effect. And that's true on one level, but on another level, it was an overwhelming success. It continued and reinforced this absolute fantasy of a consumer economy. That's a dysfunctional psychological exercise in propaganda. It's amazing that people believe that we can have such a thing as a consumer economy and operate it successfully for decades on decades, and forever in the minds of many. We can just have that and it'll continue and succeed, and we'll all reach nirvana somehow. People actively participate in that, and I'm a hypocrite because I'm just as guilty as the next person. I hop, skip, and jump down to Walmart and buy this and that with my credits, just like everybody else. So I hate to sound hypocritical, but people are actively participating in all that, and the outcome. When they were talking about a wealth effect, what they wanted is people to return to consumerism and people to continue their participation in the paradigm, and it was an overwhelming success, and it remains so today. I mean, people just simply, they don't understand that we've reached a point where it can't just return back to the way it was, or the American dream, or whatever it has been that we've had this last 10 years. I don't know what you might call that, but I believe there's an overwhelming and large group of people that believe that we're going to get a handle on this virus, restart the economy, and keep on trucking. And it may be that we have that, the appearance of that. It may be that, for the summer or the rest of the year, we somehow manage to limp along with the appearance of that. I kind of doubt it, but that's not a real thing. We're not. It wasn't a real thing the last 10 years, and it certainly won't be, going forward. We're likely to have some appearance of that and Dow 39,000, 49,000 or whatever. And, I'm not sure exactly what's going to help folks get to a point where they understand that, this isn't reality. But those are all concerning developments for me, the reinforcement of kind of these false beliefs and false ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. And for someone in your position in a professional capacity, it's extremely difficult because you're having to balance. I mean, I can sit here and talk about things, but it doesn't impact, my professional capacity the way it does. It can be very acute for you in trying to explain to people the reality. And I think it comes back to probably another point worth making, and to get your observations, is you've talked about the real economy and how does the United States reindustrialize and stop being consumption-based, particularly given what is coming. And we don't need to dwell on hyperinflation too much, and obviously the effect it will have on US imports. But from your perspective, how do you see the US reindustrializing? I mean, obviously from my perspective, it looks extremely difficult, and it's going to be fraught with enormous problems. But for all the things I've discussed, but I'd like to get your perspective, what you think may be possible, or is what might be a bridge too far, et cetera, et cetera.
Gotcha. So, I see a lot of folks on Twitter and on podcasts and things kind of put two and two together and say, okay, it's necessary for the United States to reindustrialize, and take that fact, that the inevitability of the United States reindustrializing, and reach a conclusion that says, great, we're going to reindustrialize and everybody's going to have productive jobs and it's going to be wonderful, and kind of not spend the time to think that process through. Okay, how do we get from here to there? Of the folks that do kind of think that through a little bit, I see a lot of folks say, okay, we devalue our currency, and there you go. We're there. It's fait accompli at that point, or some other kind of ingredient, perhaps in a recipe for reindustrialization, but not a recipe. Even if we had all the ingredients, we've still got to combine them properly and bake the cake. And baking the cake, in this case, is like a 10-year thing, a 10-year process. Nobody knows for sure exactly how long it takes to reindustrialize an economy, but it's certainly not an overnight thing, and certainly not, you just have a couple of the preconditions and ingredients, and there you go. So I think any celebration about the inevitability of reindustrialization is very premature. You've made this point a number of times, but reindustrialization of the United States, reindustrialization has been inevitable for a long time. Donald Trump talked about it extensively in his campaign. And, at that point, I was a little bit celebratory myself to think, okay, we've got a leader that gets it, that sees what has to happen, has told us he has a plan for making it happen. This is great. It needed to happen. It needed to begin in January of 2017. That's when there was a real good chance, a real good ramp that we could have taken to try to gain some speed and altitude and see if we could launch into that process and that future. And we would, at that time, we would have had all the help with that in the world. We would have been assisted by every nation on earth, because having a strong, productive United States is in everybody's best interest. But we really missed that opportunity, just totally missed that opportunity. There has been, this is not my strongest area. I don't study this stuff day in and day out. But I personally haven't seen a tremendous amount of increase in productive capacity in the United States. I can remember early on there were big headlines when, Carrier Group that makes heating and air conditioning units decided not to relocate. There was some stuff up in the Northeast, I think, with Foxconn. There have been isolated stories about productivity and industrialization, but by and large, not much has happened lately in the recent past. And so that we that's water under the bridge. We missed our opportunity. I'm not sure how we get there from here. I'm not sure how that looks or what that process entails, but strictly the fact that it's necessary and inevitable at some point is not a basis for any kind of counting of chickens or celebration, because it's going to take a long time. It's going to involve a lot of investment, and I have no idea where that's going to come from. It can't really be financed by the Fed, because that has incredibly inflationary effects, which kind of compound a lot of the existing problems. And the rest of the world's just not going to be very eager to help at this stage. So, you asked me what I thought that process looked like, and I don't really have a good answer to that, but I do have a lot of concern for what I see out there.
Yeah, but the thing is, the concern and the lack of visibility is perfectly reasonable, because there is these insurmountable challenges as things stand, and in a broader sense, as the whole world has to adjust and rotate to what's coming, and not just in terms of the virus and the economic impact, but in a broader sense, then they're going to have their own challenges to face, and therefore, if one nation has problems or is going through this reindustrialization or rotation of its economy, then it's a lot easier to get for that nation to be able to get the support to do that. I mean, and that's, ironically, precisely what China's done for quite a few years. They've been rotating their economy before any of this was ever going to happen. No, I mean, not the virus, because no one knows about it, but just this part of this reset. That Russia's done it to some extent. Other nations across the world have done it, and but Western nations have been just asleep at the wheel, imagining somehow that $1 million of debt can be resolved by another $1 million, and another million, and then $1 billion, and then $1 trillion, and therefore there is. It's just, but I think that's a fundamental problem in the West, is we're always very reactive to things. I am working in the financial sector in a whole bunch of banks and whatever. That was the one thing that always used to be something that I was astonished by, because it was always reactive thing. Measures were taken. There was never sort of a proactive approach that went, well, hang on. And, and even if people recognize things, I mean, I mentioned things, you could see things that were major problems, and people would just dismiss it because it was now, it's a bit like you say, that the markets always go up, this will never happen. And there was a similar perspective in 2007, until the point, obviously when everything topped out, that this was a gravy train that was never going to end. And of course, the problem is we've had this long-term gravy train since 2008 that skews people's perspective as well. So, it's a huge challenge, and that's why we need a reality check and a perspective that deals with what is going to happen. Because there's more importantly than anything else, Western nations have got to roll up their sleeves for what's coming and work extremely hard to rebuild nations. If people are under the impression that that's not necessary, they're going to take a lot longer to recover from the fallout of what's coming before they even start to consider the process of rebuilding a nation. So by dealing with reality, it helps people to deal with what's coming. And one fear I have is if people are struggling now with what's happening, and it's going to get a whole lot worse, not in relation to the virus, that's a whole separate accelerant, but in a general sense, they're going to have a lot more challenges than what they're dealing with now. And and a lot of the reason they're struggling now is because they thought the economy was wonderful. They thought that the US was in this amazing, strong economic shape because they've been told that for far too long, way beyond Trump. We can blame Trump to some extent, but the Obama administration, the same kind of nonsense. So this is where the illusion is going to crush people a lot more. It's that saying, as someone once said to me, well, it was their father who said to them, if you don't embrace change, change will crush you. And that's a big, big problem that the US faces, the UK, but I think the US has bigger challenges because the perspective inside the US is largely, we're the greatest nation, we're the dominant nation, we've got the strongest military, we've got the strongest economy, and when we want to do something, the world says, fine. What do you want us to do? Well, that's going to make the challenge even harder because it's not just the rolling up your sleeves. I think it's the mental attitude and to deal with what's coming. And that concerns me as well, that people are not going to be resilient. And how do they respond not being resilient to having to deal with something that we can't have this kind of reflective period of assessing what's happening over weeks or months. There's going to be a need to roll sleeves up and start to do the ugly, dirty stuff from day one. And that applies in other Western nations, but I think the US, it's more acute. Would you agree with that particular sentiment or not? It's easy for me sat on this side of the Atlantic to make those observations, but I'd like to get your perspective as an American who's grown up there, lived there all your life, as to how you feel Americans are going to do in coping with those enormous economic changes aside from the virus.
Right. Yeah. So a couple of thoughts, on the one level, I'm an American and, I want to wave the flag a little bit and say, we're a nation that's built upon the ideal of the individual, and there's independence and a rugged spirit. We have a history of being an incredibly productive, inventive nation, and there's definitely some of that which hasn't been extinguished and can't be extinguished. And so I'm very optimistic about the long-term prospect of the United States and the rebuilding and what we can achieve, when we're, properly understanding what's before us and get our wits about us and tackle that challenge as best we can. But, I definitely share a lot of the concerns that you voiced. And, if we look at this response to this virus as a microcosm of the reset, we can see that the government and leadership has reacted and tried to put together a plan and a response to the situation that made sense, effective, and attempted to get everyone to buy into it and participate in it. And they've struggled to do that because, people took some different perspectives and said, okay, well, actually, government's the problem. This is an attempt to double down authoritarianism, or it's some type of an attempt to roll out nefarious agenda of technocracy and, chemistry and vaccines and everything along those lines, and go back to how fundamentally suspicious of government our population is, and that's extremely deserved. It's a wise perspective, because of all the insanity that's gone on domestically and internationally, under the banner of the United States and everything. But it's been difficult to formulate this appropriate response, and I can't say this, with authority and certainty, but I think it's been more difficult for the United States to get the population here to buy into the appropriate response to this medical situation than it has been in other places. I know that, initially Italy struggled to get everybody on board, and then, when the deaths started really mounting up, people kind of got it and got in line. I think in Asia, it's been easier to get everybody on board, but I think in the United States, it's been a little bit more difficult. And so if you say, when this illusion of the greatest economy in the history of the universe is finally broken, you're going to have orders of magnitude more disorientation than you have in relation to this virus and this quarantine lockdown scenario. People are going to say, wait a minute, you're telling me I'm not rich? You're telling me we're not rich as a nation? What are you telling me here? So there's going to be this extreme disorientation. There's going to be a lot of desperation, a lot of sorrow, sadness. It's going to be an extremely difficult situation for a lot of people, individually and collectively. It's very, very clear that there is not a pre-existing, well thought out, coordinated plan to deal with this necessary rebuild after the reset. It's extremely clear that our leadership has chosen a different path to fight tooth and nail to hold on to the existing paradigm. There's no graceful acceptance of reality and let's move forward productively with the help of other nations. That just doesn't exist. Certain quarters of the internet have a firm belief in the plan, and there's just not a lot of evidence of that plan being in existence or being executed. So I think it's just time for everybody to come to grips with the fact that there's not much of a plan for a post-reset America. So you're going to see the government scramble and kind of wildly swing and sway in their response to reality. It's going to be difficult for them to galvanize the public behind any initiatives that they come up with. They're not going to be well thought out. They're not going to be well designed and productive. It's probably going to be it's probably going to be a longer period until they come to grips with a post-reset scenario themselves, and before they strike out in a positive, productive direction. And even then, they're going to have engendered so much distrust and hatred and skepticism that it's going to be extremely difficult to get the public behind any kind of initiative that is productive. And it's going to be equally difficult for the public to do it themselves. There are so few that understand the reality of the situation that we're faced with, that any type of organization and planning or any type of initiatives, it's going to be extremely difficult for us as the public to create that and move in a productive direction, because you're not going to. This is the type of situation that just requires a coordinated, well thought out, planned response or initiative. And who's going to come up with that? And then, even if such a thing existed, how is everybody going to get on board? How are they going to create buy-in? I don't know. I don't see that.
Yeah, I mean, yes.
Good one.
I was just going to. Well, I was going to just say exactly what you're going to say, Sonny. That's CJ. No, Sonny, thank you for a wonderful discussion. It's very enlightening, because I know, for me on this side of the Atlantic, talking about the US is one thing, but to get someone else's perspective who lives there, breathes there, has spent his whole life there, and rightly, is proud of the nation. And because, I've said this all along, and the US government is not representative of the American people. I know a lot of wonderful American people, including both of you two, and I say what I say because I care passionately that it's a great nation amongst equals, and one day we'll get there. But have you got any closing thoughts before we finish that you'd like to mention?
Well, I definitely want to revisit that waving the flag, and hope that I haven't come off as anti-American or anything of the sort. I am proud to be an American. I definitely feel like we're a special nation that had our founding documents well written. The principles under which we were organized are special, are just, and ultimately we're going to have a great future. It's unfortunate what our leadership has chosen to do over the past several decades, taking us in a very bad direction that really has nothing to do with our nation's founding principles or our fundamentals that we will definitely return to. We've been left in a very precarious, unfortunate situation. It's going to take some time for us to get our wits about ourselves and return to sound decision making based upon our principles. But that will happen, and it will take some time, and it'll be in the hands of the public to restore some sound leadership. But it will ultimately happen, and we'll be a much better nation on a going forward basis. So I do want to hope that everybody understands, my perspective and where I'm coming from in that regard.
Oh, I don't doubt for 1 minute they do. It's obvious that you care greatly for your nation, and rightly so. But I think on that note, we thank you very much again, Sonny. Really appreciate it. The conversation today and your perspective on all the things we've discussed. And so thank you. And we look forward to speaking again at some point in the future.
Thank you both.
Absolutely. Paul, Sonny, thank you both for a great conversation. And for our Gadfly subscribers tuning into this live stream free play, don't forget to go over to the gadfly.vhx.tv. Check it out. We offer a 30-day free trial. Then from there, you can either do $10 a month or save a little bit of money and do the $100 for a year program. So Sonny and Paul, let's do this again soon. Gentlemen, enjoy the rest of your day.
And likewise.
Take care.